session this afternoon is, in fact, one I've been looking forward to all day, and that's because I'm going to be interviewing Nik Gowing, and Nik has just written this book here, which he's brought 2 copies of, and I brought my own copy of as well. Nik and I first met at one of those extraordinarily pleasant weekends that sometimes comes into your life, where we all went off to pale wine. We stayed in an absolutely lovely house, my wife and I, talking with absolutely lovely, intelligent people. And we met Nik on drinks on a Friday evening. And I thought, my gosh, this guy is extraordinarily interesting. And then he told me all about his idea about thinking the unthinkable. We went to one of the tents on the Saturday morning, and we listened to it, and I was completely...
in a thunderstorm.
It was, yes, it was in a thunderstorm, and I was completely enraptured by it, and I thought, this is just brilliant stuff. And you had a phrase there that you called it thinking the unthinkable, and then you said, nothing's unthinkable, but a lot is unpalatable, and people don't like to look at unpalatable ideas. And I thought that completely puts a finger on it. So I thought it'd be a really good idea for Nik and I to have a bit of a conversation, and for you to listen in to all of that. And I hope you buy the book. Nik has only bought 2 copies. One looks fairly annotated, but perhaps he'll sell the other one to the highest bidder. But Nik, why don't you tell us about your book? I've got some questions, but I know that you also love talking about your ideas as well, and I just hand over to you to talk about thinking the unthinkable for a moment.
Thanks very much indeed, James. This is not really about selling the book, forget about that. This is about ideas. Many of you will know that I used to be in television. I used to be a main presenter at the BBC until about 4.5 years ago. I'd left of my own accord. I'd been in television for 35 years. And the reason that I say that is because as I decided to leave, and having been in many places, including under the Berlin Wall the night it fell, in Poland during 1980, 81 during the Solidarity movement, during martial law, and revealing that the Russians were leaving Afghanistan in 1988. When I was leaving the BBC, it was the time when Putin decided to do what he's now still doing in eastern Ukraine. He seized Crimea, and it became very clear, and I'm summarizing in very short order here, that there was a new normal emerging. Now, that had to be tested, and I was not looking particularly for something to do, but I was approached by someone who said, what about leadership in this current series of challenges? And I said that one thing that's on my mind at the moment as I step aside and have more time to think is that there's a lot of unthinkables happening at the moment. The violation of international law, the violation of international rights, which Putin got engaged in. And then the World Health Organization refused to accept that Ebola was going to decimate West Africa, despite what Save the Children, Médecins Sans Frontières was saying. Other things were happening, like suddenly the oil price was going down to $30, $25 a barrel. There was something happening in the world, and Michael Ignatieff, who's now trying to run the university in Budapest, despite all the pressures from the government, when he was still professor of practice at Harvard, came to Chatham House and said, what we're seeing now is a new normal. This all started over a flat white coffee when I said to somebody, I'm more than happy to look at this and start interviewing people at the top, right at the top, chairman, chief executives. This went on through 2014, 2015. Then the migration crisis hit. By that stage, I had asked my now colleague, Chris Langdon, who is managing director of the Oxford Research Group, to join me. And this now became something much bigger, because what we could feel was that there was a new normal which those at the top were struggling to cope with. Re-rack to Ukraine, one of the issues is why in November 2013 did the External Action Service and ultimately the Commission and the Council of the European Union believe that Putin would accept an association agreement for Ukraine? He'd warned about it, but somehow in the External Action Service there was this feeling of we can't really mean what he said. That was the first series of signals which are simply ignored. Unthinkables? No, they were unpalatables. No one would believe Putin's warnings in Bucharest and elsewhere of the fact that he wanted to reconvene essentially the old Soviet Union. We now know that's happening. But back 4.5 years ago, that was seen as antediluvial almost. Now, what we managed to do was, and the research in this is important because everything I'm going to tell you is based on data. We've got 2,500 pages of data of interviews with top people, chief executives, chairmen, senior government officials, senior public officials as well, senior politicians, not just in the UK, but right around the world. And they're all scared, They are all overwhelmed, they are all fearful. Their words, not ours. We didn't say, are you fearful? Are you overwhelmed? That is what they have volunteered. This is not just about Brexit. It's not just about Trump. It's about potentially the existential threats now to governance and also to the corporate survival in this new environment. Now, I have to say that when Chris and I put together our first report, we did it for the Chartered Institute of Management Accountants. They were prepared to provide some money, but they hadn't a clue of what we were going to discover. And they didn't like what we discovered. As a result, they pushed back and said, we're not going to publish this. And it took the education director to say, this is really important. It is new data. It goes against the grain. We should all be worried. And in February 2016, they agreed to publish it. And that set off a chain of interest and concern, but also a chain of resistance, because no one could really believe the enormity of what is happening. Fast forward, and our main conclusion is this. The conformity which gets you to the top, in many ways now disqualifies you from appreciating the enormity of what is taking place, the disruption that's taking place, and how to handle it. Because by the nature of how you got to the top, you're not prepared for it. And I can see some heads nodding here, and if we were among senior executives, almost all of them would be nodding as well. It is counterintuitive, but that's the reality. Second headline, the next generation are deeply disconcerted by what they see. And in our book, we have two forwards, one by Lord Nick Stern, and also one by a 30-year-old, representing the fact that what we have done here is about addressing the deep concerns of the next generation. It's fascinating that in all of this, those at the top are more worried about their brand, their reputation, their pension, their share options, and also just handling regulation in the business world. You may say we're capitalizing on something here, but look what's happened in Hungary, look what's happening in Italy, look what's happening in Poland, look what's happened in France, look what's happening in Sweden, and look what happened in the election here last year. We don't call it populism, we call it pushbackism. It's pushing back against the system which is not seen to be serving those, whether you're in the corporate sector or in the government sector. And on the 1st of June 2016, we did the cover story of The World Today for Chatham House, in which we predicted Brexit would be voted for. 23 days later, we also said in paragraph 1 that Trump would be nominated and probably elected. And this indicated the lack of willingness by those who are meant to assess risk of understanding the unthinkables and ultimately the unpalatables. The migration crisis, which almost floored Chancellor Merkel, 1.2 million migrants, refugees, displaced people heading for Germany. You know, it took 6 months for her to form a coalition. I was in Berlin last week. It's the tectonic plates have shifted, and we've seen it in Bavaria this weekend as well. She was not prepared to believe the enormity of the migration wave and the impact it would have. It was unthinkable, but actually it was unpalatable. I was with Donald Tusk and various leaders on a platform in Slovenia when the razor wire was going up across the border in Hungary, in Serbia, and in Austria as well. They refused to believe the enormity of what was taking place. They could not conceive it. They wouldn't even talk about it on a public platform. But a year later, Franz Timmermans, the first Vice President of the European Union, said that this whole crisis of migration in January of last year brought the European Union, quote, to the brink. Now, this is a long answer, James, but it's about how those at the top are handling this, and many, frankly, and I know I'm being recorded, are shit scared. Because they know their regulatory and political obligations, but they can see the reality that's unwinding. Set aside Brexit, set aside Trump. This is about AI. It's about the skills deficit. It's about the number of jobs which are going to disappear. Citigroup getting rid of 10,000 out of 20,000 back office people. BT getting rid of 13,000 people. All these things, quite apart from Maplin's, Toys R Us and so on, are indicative of what we would call, and now even Andy Haldane has gone public, the chief economist of the Bank of England, on Radio 4 3 weeks ago, which we've already written about, This potentially is the hollowing out of the middle class. These are the kind of things which are deeply, deeply uncomfortable to talk about. But when people, accountants, lawyers, are going to be replaced by robots or AI and algorithms, each of those has got spending power in the community. And already you're beginning to see in some parts of London and elsewhere, quite apart from the decimation of shops from the Amazon problem, you're already beginning to see those at the top cashing in while they can before there's the inevitable slump, which is going to happen. Gerard and others may disagree with me, but that's after all what came out of Bali last week and what we heard from Jim O'Neill, the new chairman of Chatham House 2 weeks ago. So I don't bring you bad news, I just give you realism. There are many who've said we're being pessimistic. I would say that good leadership is about understanding the enormity of what's happening and working out what to do with it, as opposed to saying that's a blip. Even Fukuyama, as we reported, he was on Start the Week yesterday, was it today or yesterday, has said that even what he said about the, when was it, 15 years ago, was wrong. We don't subscribe to the kind of optimism that there's been expressed. When Kaplan talks about a return to the jungle, you have to see what is happening now as potentially no longer a natural improvement in our lifestyles and a natural improvement, which is what everyone expects, but actually a consolidation and possibly much worse. And the question, therefore, is how leaders are going to handle this. Chatham House did this cartoon, which we've bought from them, on the front of our book, of leaders who are trying to lead but with blindfolds on, because many of them do not want to really accept the enormity of what is happening and how to adjust their institutions. I'd be interested in anyone who wants to challenge us head on this, because this is a dynamic engagement. That's why I say it's not about a book. A book about it is about capturing a moment. We wrote 100,000 words in 3 months, but already things are moving on. And you might ask, and I know I'm being recorded, what's happened? You know, what's happened with Jamal Khashoggi, and we have to assume he's been murdered. I was at the FII in Saudi Arabia a year ago, and I came away thinking the kind of optimism that is being expressed here in Saudi Arabia from Mohammed bin Salman is not something which can endure. And I was staying in one of the rooms in the Ritz-Carlton, which 3 weeks later became a prison cell for one of 200 people detained. And so that is unthinkable to many people, but in many ways it's unpalatable because the evidence has been there of the kind of things that could happen, like in the war in Yemen. Think of where we are now, a year on from Me Too. If we'd been meeting James 18 months ago, would we have been saying that Me Too would decimate so many organizations?
Not at all.
Look at what's happened even to the Nobel organization, where there's been a fundamental kind of pushback. Okay, there are now questions about some of the evidence in some of the Me Too movement, but it's about how the assumption was, certainly from men in big business, that they could get away with it. Unthinkable? No, unpalatable. Similarly, would we have been talking about a chemical weapons attack in the homeland of the United Kingdom? No. Look at what is happening, and what is happening now with the Russian subversion, which Andrew Parker of MI5 has said very clearly, the Russians are now more active around Britain and elsewhere than they ever have been. We're seeing the potential now for utilities, for just-in-time deliveries to be switched off when politically the wrong things are said. So what I've done in literally 6 or 7 minutes is given you a portrait of why we're saying thinking the unthinkable, but ultimately how a leader's going to cope with this. We talk about a culture of mindset, a culture, mindset and behavior challenge, and also listening to the next generation inside your organization. And in fact, only in the last few hours, one of the 10 chapters is about DBS, the Development Bank of Singapore, 23,000 only, run by Piyush Gupta, being named the best bank in the world. And why is that? Because they've been taking on Gandalf, Google, Android, Netflix, and so on, at their own game and trying to win in this time of disruption, but using, above all, the under 35s, the under 30s in hackathons to develop ways forward based on your own internal resources. They don't want consultants anymore. Similarly, OCP, the big potash producer in Morocco, they've created internally Le Mouvement, which is the next generation who have been deciding how the company needs to reconfigure itself. Many of the next generation were deeply skeptical. Will this really change the company? It has. And we also profiled Indra Nooyi, who's just left as chief executive of Pepsi with Performance with Purpose, the kind of real struggle she had to get a reduction of sugar consumption and greater sustainability for producing the kind of things which has made Pepsi an enormous corporation. And she's now moving on to be a senior figure in the B team, which is designed as a new momentum to try and encourage new leaders and old leaders to think in a different way, to be emboldened. It's about saying, I may be a good leader, or people expect me to be a good leader, but I need to listen to other people. And that's what many of our case studies are about, based on those out there who are saying, I realized I don't know everything, I know other people know much more, let's listen to them.
I always find talking to you and chatting to you a refreshing, invigorating experience. One of the things that, and I've had this very same thing, you know that I'm very involved with senior members of the Royal Navy, and one of the problems they have, and one of the problems you point out in your book, is that senior CEOs spend all of their time firefighting. And it's just, there's so much pressure to do stuff, to react to people all the time. How do you find the time to think? And the answer for most of them is, they don't. They don't find the time to think. They know that they just don't have time to contemplate this sort of thing. They wish they did, but they don't. How have you found, how have the leaders that you've spoken to, what have they said about this? And they're sort of, where do you find that day, a month, or even less, but some time to look at the big picture, to sit back, to come to an event like this at Legatum and say, you know what, I'm just going to listen for a day, and I'm going to scribble down some notes, and that's going to help me in my business.
Well, we can't run their offices, but there's no doubt from the 10 profiles that we've got that not of people, but of organizations, but it's about the human ability to do that, but this is crucial, but they've got to create it for themselves. Let me go back, and this is not about the military, but one of our chapters, we identified General Nik Gowing, who's now the Chief of Defence since the 11th of June. We identified what he was trying to do in the Army 3 years ago, which was to reform it. When he arrived 4 years ago...
This is the US Army?
No, in the British Army, General Nik Gowing. He was immediately hit by a problem which he never expected, which was sexual inappropriate behaviour, and the amount of what was going on. He said he had to set out to reform the Army. He's alienated a lot in the Army. Many of the next generation are leaving as a result. But he made it very clear, and there are other sides to this, that the enormity of reform and trying to take stuff on, quote, is like trying to eat an elephant in one mouthful. Because it's impossible, but you've got to somehow do it. It's like a Rubik's Cube. There's now so much which confronts people. And he said, although some of those who serve him are saying, that you've got to have far more empathy, you've got to have far more humility, even in the military. And what you do is you listen, you get feedback, but once you've taken a decision, that's the order. Now, obviously that's a military side of it. The important part is, though, that even with all this reform, he's got nominated and became Chief of Defence. So there's value in taking a risk. You've raised the military side of this. But it's about eating an elephant in one mouthful. It's a great phrase. And that's what most are actually confronting. We've got a chapter here, which is an anonymous chapter, which was a remarkable discussion with a chief executive, who essentially talks about this now, running a massive corporate is almost inhuman. Is almost inhuman. It is now so difficult. You are never going to succeed. Look what's happened to Paul Pullman. Seen as a great sort of success at Unilever, and suddenly it's all come unbundled. And he's a great advocate of what needs to be done for leadership. So there's always something that's going to come and hit you, and that's really something which you've got to be hardened against, sensitive to. But Piyush Gupta from DBS, who's now just got this award, a bank of only 23,000 employees, has been in that job for 10 years. And one of the things coming through is don't keep disposing of your chief executives and senior people, because actually they know how it works. And so what we're doing with our case studies, and we've got amazing access, no one told us what to write, we have amazing access, which are designed as how can we thrive on change rather than be disrupted and defenestrated by change. And that's really difficult, but it can be done, and that's something to encourage people.
And DBS is, of course, public sector as well, so a lot of times people think of public sector as being perhaps a bit less agile, a bit less on the ball than some of your cutting-edge private sector companies. And so I remember reading the DBS chapter and thinking, this is fantastically interesting because he's taking a bunch of people who have in a mindset of sort of safety first. These aren't people who chose what might be seen as a risky career. They chose a career that was safe. And yet here they've got a chief executive who's pushing them, and eventually they learn to really enjoy it.
That's exactly it. I'm actually going to declare an interest here. I'm a visiting professor at Nanyang University in Singapore, and it's fair to say that there is a top-down culture in Singapore which produces excellence in some ways. So what Piyush, who's of Indian descent, has done is challenge even the Singaporean spirit and say, we've got to do things differently. If you're 25, I want to hear from you. I don't want you to just become a server of this bank up until you're 55. These are the kind of spirits we've tried to get over. When we started down this, or I started down this track 4 years ago, I never expected to still be doing this. But it is now such a, and I'm using the word which is used to us many times, these are now existential threats. And the challenge in all of this is to open this up, to embolden, and I'm using that word again, leaders who frankly are quietly thinking about it, whether they can do their job, but don't want to tell anyone. And I had a salutary experience where a board member, a member of a board of a very large financial institution, said, we've got a serious problem. I want you to come and talk to our C-suite and the chief executive. I turned up at 8 o'clock in the morning, and he walked in pretty self-confidently and said, look, I've only got 45 minutes. I don't know why I'm here. The company secretary told me to come, and a board member told me to come. 2 hours later, he was still there, and he said, I'm realizing things about leadership which I'd never even begun to think about, and I'm chief executive. So it's about how you open eyes in a comfortable way, which means that those at the top don't feel pinned to the wall by regulation, by shareholders, and you've got to have more enlightenment here.
Got time for just a couple of questions if there's some in the audience. Rosie?
I had a question about the point that you just raised about not rotating chief executives very much. I'm in finance, we always get accused of being short-term, but I'm always worried about government, because the rotation that you see between different ministries and so on happens, very, very regularly. How do you try and build up that depth of experience, and how can you ensure that they're asking the right questions and that the experience is learned from?
Well, I can't tell them how to do it, but without going too far, and I know I'm on the record here, there are voices of deep concern in public service about this. Rotation tends to be the way the civil service works, but when you look at what Ivan Rogers said when he left on January the 3rd, 2 years ago, as the representative, because he'd fallen out with Theresa May, about how you uphold the civil service code, the clash that's going on made even worse, and I know others are in the audience, and I'm not making a political point here, but it's become bloody tough for civil servants to speak truth under power, because politicians, including in the United States in ways, and in France now, and in Germany to a certain extent, which is coming through from the Chancellery, being told, you tell me what I want to know, not what I should hear. And that's why it's becoming potentially, and I use that phrase again, an existential challenge to governance. When a Director General of a government department here in the United Kingdom says, if I don't tell the Secretary of State or the Minister what he or she wants to hear, I get my legs blown off. That's a very serious problem. It's becoming a career-limiting move. Now, it's not us who's saying that, it's others. Now, I can't go too far on this in public, but there is real concern. It ain't going to be sorted during the Brexit crisis. But let me just put to you a broader point. And I'm conscious that Gerard and Liam still here, and others like that are still here. And again, I'm not making a political point, but we have to be concerned on issues like skills and reskilling, and the next generation, and robotics and AI, when if I ask someone in the Cabinet Office, how much discussion is there about this in Cabinet, and that person goes like that, not to mimic Trump, but just simply to say there are strategic, structural issues on which the future of a nation like the United Kingdom relies, which are really not being addressed in the way that's needed, in the way that can boost the economy again, and above all, overcome this demographic sort of hangover. There's one thing I'm going to read in a moment, but it's not for me to tell people how to run government and so on, or how to run a company. I'm reflecting to you what they're saying to us, and deep concerns. And I think what's interesting when you get 3, 4, 8, 10 in a room together, we call it a kind of beanbag gathering, and they're all of a peer level. they all start saying, that's me too. In fact, even though I'm on the record, it's a bit like dealing with alcoholics. No one wants to talk about being an alcoholic. And then one of them says, actually, it's real shit. To quote Sir Peter Gershon, the chairman of National Grid, being a company leader these days, we need to find new ways of doing this work. Otherwise, we're all going to be overwhelmed. And suddenly, they're all talking about it privately. You won't get them talking publicly about it. I should make clear that all our work is based on data. It's been scanned by, we're employing people to handle the data, and it's been independently peer-reviewed. So what we're saying is not based on a hunch of Gowing and Langdon. It's based on actually very tight data analysis of hard data from all the interviews.
Do you want to read the passage?
Is there another question?
Is
Does
there another
everyone
question?
want to leave now already? Have I
Okay.
worried them too much?
What was the piece of data that surprised you the most in your book?
Actually, Gerard, none of the data surprised us. I was surprised that the data confirmed exactly what we had already assumed. And that was the great danger that we confronted, that we were trying to perpetuate something which we had assumed. Instead of which the data reaffirmed it. I could put it up there, but I don't have it to hand. Reaffirmed it, and what the data rescrape we did in April this year, which is in the book and it's a part of one of the appendices, strengthened the issue of how worried people at the top are in a private one-to-one environment. Now, you meet a lot of people, and obviously people are being opportunistic at the moment. There's a lot of money swashing around in the economy, and who knows when it's going to come to an awful crash. But it's the kind of things they've said to us in private. Interestingly, unless anyone wants to say it here, I'm not going to nail you to the mast on this one. No one has yet said you're wrong. We expected a far more vibrant pushback, unless you want to say that, Gerard.
Well, we'll wait and see. Actually, I do think we should be far more positive. Actually, in terms of AI and technology, people do overassume what robots can do. They are robots. There's a lot of work being done on this at the moment.
Sure.
But in terms of the time span, we haven't got to this situation where robots can start to do many of the skills that humans can do. So I think people over-exaggerate. But the point I would push back on is that if you think of this as an industrial revolution, every previous industrial revolution in terms of jobs has had three characteristics. One, there's been a negative impact on substitution. Jobs have disappeared. But there's always been two positives. There's an income effect, high productivity effect. Prices go down, people have more money to spend. And there's lots of jobs that are created. And that's the interesting thing. So there is definitely change. People can't always handle the change. But the outcome often, in the past, it's always proved ultimately beneficial.
Let me put an alternative view, and we won't disagree here, but just to sort of qualify that, remember though that in the past the speed of change was slower in comparison to what's happening at the moment. And there hasn't been that level of accountability, instant accountability expected by the public. That's why I talk about it as pushbackism as opposed to just populism. It's pushback against this feeling that this is leaving me behind. And we can argue that Brexit was part of that, as we've seen as well in Hungary and Italy and in Sweden 3 weeks ago. But I hear what you're saying. I'm not suggesting it's perhaps as stark as what I said, but it's the ability to handle this at the speed. And if I go and have this kind of presentation, but a fuller presentation in legal conferences and accountancy conferences, there is that kind of sense of being shit scared. Because there are these data around suggesting that anything between 75 and 95% of legal jobs will be replaced by algorithms. Each of those is someone with a mortgage and a family and spending power within communities. Maybe history will show that actually this is too bleak. But I'm reflecting here not our view, but the view of those in the professions. And each of those is middle to upper middle class with that spending power. I mean, again, not to try and convince the skeptics, but we've talked to a lot of people over 3 or 4 years, many of whom did not want to go public. But one of those who decided to go public is Joe Kaiser, who's the global president and chief executive of Siemens, and has dramatically won the battle against General Electric, or GE in many ways. He decided early this year to say the following, and it slightly addresses what you just said, John. If we get the revolution right, digitization will benefit the nearly 10 billion humans inhabiting our planet by the year 2050. But if we get it wrong, societies will be divided into winners and losers. Social unrest and anarchy will arise. The glue that holds societies and communities together will disintegrate, and citizens will no longer believe that governments are able to fulfill their purpose of enforcing the rule of law and providing security. Now that's what we were hinting at in our first document of 2 years ago, and people wondered what we've been smoking. But when you've got people like Larry Fink, who's not going to FII next week, and Steve Schwartzman saying the same thing, you've got to understand that change is faster than you can cope with. And you've got chief executives saying openly, like Ian Conor-Centrica, who says publicly, he wonders if human beings can actually handle the pace, the scale, the depth of change at the pace the public expect. You can understand where this kind of analysis is coming from. I hope, if I'm invited back in 5 years, that you'll all say, Gowing, you and Chris were over pessimistic. I would say we're being realistic. But this is the challenge for leaders. You can counter this by actually accepting it's going to happen. In the same way, if we've been talking 4 years ago about the scale of Russian subversion, the Mirror yesterday had the story of how there's a Foreign Office memo, particularly to MI6, once you've left, be careful, you're about to be compromised by the GIEO or certainly the FSB, because they're after you. This is going back to the 1950s and 1960s in the way that Andrew Parker, the head of MI5, has warned about. But it doesn't come easily to people. It's a nice day here in London. Surely there's not subversion here. No. The Russians and Chinese are hedging their positions at that moment when they want to switch it off. Could I just leave you with one final story? Comes from a Swedish diplomatic source. 3 years ago, the Russians were determined to win the Eurovision Song Contest in Sweden. They were determined, and it was an indication of what then happened, as Hillary Clinton now confirms in her memoirs, about what happened in the election in the United States 3 years ago. They were determined to win the Eurovision Song Contest, and they were determined to fix the voting system. I don't care about the Eurovision Song Contest. Anyway, the vote came through, and Russia came third. Beaten into third place, I happened to be in Queensland at the time, by that new European power, get this, Australia. Australia beat Russia into third place. Australia was second in the Eurovision Song Contest. Who came third? First, Ukraine, with a story about Stalin suppressing the Tatars. The Russians were enraged. What did they do? They downed 2 Crystal Palace-size radio masts and scrambled the air traffic control system for several hours, as if to say, don't you screw with us. We have ways of getting back at you.
For a song contest. I hope you feel like I do, that that's the absolute perfect way and an absolute fantastic day. Thank you so much.
Shall I cheer you up?
No, but it energized me, which is even better. So please join us if you've got a bit of time for a glass of wine outside, and otherwise just